It is my honor to speak at the Ecological Civilization Theory and Practice Training Program at Thousand Lakes. I would like to extend my deep gratitude to High Seoul Academy, especially to President Ms. Liu Yixin for inviting me. Every student who participates in this training program has my admiration. I can sense the light of hope of ecological civilization from you. My topic today is from industrial civilization to ecological civilization, a necessary transition. I will appreciate any comments you might have. Cultural patterns change slowly. It took hundreds of years for modern societies to give up the idea that slavery was acceptable, and it is still practiced in various forms. The role of women began as slaves thousands of years ago. The marriage contract replaced slavery, but the role of women was still subservient to men until the 20th century. Even now, male dominance is still a factor in economics and politics. Change takes place in history very slowly. The shift from industrial civilization to ecological civilization is the same. It would normally require hundreds of years to make the adjustment, but we do not have that much time. The shift is going to happen in the next 20 to 40 years. Industrial civilization requires a large amount of energy to provide cities with their capacity to operate. As the external sources of energy decline in the coming decades, we will be left primarily with human energy and some energy from animals. Wind energy and solar energy will not save industrial civilization because a lot of petroleum and coal are required to produce the equipment to make renewable energy. Green energy will help as a transition, but it is only a short-term or partial solution. By 2050, we must make a substantial portion of the transition to an ecological civilization. While we are being forced to change our way of life as we lose cheap sources of energy, we will also be struggling with the increased damage from climate change. That will impede progress toward a transition. But I am going to focus mostly on energy scarcity since its effects are more universal. Many will not believe what I am saying. People who live in cities and who are dependent on cheap electricity and gasoline imagine that our way of life can be sustained forever. The alternative is unthinkable. Every time I take food from the refrigerator or cook it on the stove, I wonder what it will be like to live without electricity. I will not be able to buy food at a modern grocery store, and I will not be able to store it at home or cook it. I will need to buy food every day, but how will I find it? The farms are too far away. In short, the collapse of industrial civilization will mean that I will have nothing to eat. This thought is terrifying, so most people prefer not to imagine it. It is easier to live in a dream world in which nothing will change, and the convenient life we have in cities will go on forever. Psychologically, it is hard to accept the evidence that there are limits to growth imposed by both energy scarcity and environmental damage. The technological optimism of the majority of people in cities means that it will be impossible to gain the popular support for deep change in the time remaining. Until the signs of collapse are unmistakable, the common belief will be that technology will save us. That is the hope of mechanistic or industrial civilization. We have learned to trust in the infinite capacity of the human mind and ignore the limits imposed by nature. If technology does not save us, however, then the systems that sustain an integrated economy will start to fail. The cost of electricity and fuel to drive vehicles will rise until only a few people can afford them. There will be millions of cars, trucks, and machines that will be abandoned as useless junk, since there will not be enough energy to operate most of them. By 2050 or 2060, it will be impossible in many nations for people to survive in cities because the vehicles that bring food to cities will stop operating, at least not on the scale required to feed billions of people every day. The collapse of industrial civilization and life in cities will not happen suddenly. It will occur over time, and life will gradually become more difficult, leading to urban protests and violence. That already happened in a number of countries in 2008, when there were food riots after the world price of grain doubled. That experience was an early warning sign of what will happen on a regular basis in the future. When cheap energy is no longer available, tens of millions of people will lose their jobs. They will be hungry, angry, and desperate. Few governments will have the ability to contain the conflicts that will become an ordinary part of life, particularly in cities. Somalia today is an example of a country without a real government. It maintains internal order through a clan system and traditional forms of governance. But it also allowed ocean pirates to operate from 2005 to 2017. The Somali experience indicates the kind of organized crime that we can expect when economies are spiraling downward. The order that makes it possible for citizens to do ordinary things will be hard to maintain. Because political power is tied to economic power, and economic power is tied to the use of energy, the failure of industrial civilization will set in motion a wide range of political conflicts around the world, both within nations and between them. When we plan for the future of an ecological civilization, it is important to recognize that the death of industrial civilization is not just a physical change. It will change every aspect of life. Already in the last few years, the United States, Brazil, and the Philippines have chosen autocratic leaders who offer no solutions, only hate and violence. But large crowds of angry people support them. We can expect political extremism to grow in most countries as part of the breakdown of industrial civilization. President Trump has encouraged the outbreak of civil war in the United States. That sort of violence would hasten the collapse of the US economy and the global economy. Thus, the failure of industrial civilization is already visible in the form of anger, nationalism, and irrational behavior. No one in the world will be safe as this process unfolds, because there will be a continuing danger that conflicts could lead to the use of nuclear weapons or biological weapons. If that happens, most life on Earth could be destroyed or contaminated in a matter of a few weeks. Industrial civilization is present to some degree in most countries of the world. In the future, the countries that are now classified as the poorest may have the greatest advantage. They will not fall as far when the electric systems fail. In countries where most people live in rural areas and grow their own food, people will be less affected than the ones who depend on complex economic networks to have enough food. China also has some advantages, which I will discuss later. Industrial civilization is on the verge of collapse. We cannot prevent the collapse. We cannot preserve industrial civilization, whether we want to or not. All we can do is make the transition to ecological civilization as peaceful and smooth as possible. The modern world has grown prosperous with slavery, the use of energy slaves. The BBC in England showed this dramatically. They secretly unhooked one family from the electric grid and instead produced electricity for that house using 100 volunteers on energy-generating bicycles in the house next door. For example, to make 2 pieces of toast or heated bread for breakfast required the work of 11 cyclists. At the end of the day, BBC told the family about the experiment. The family was shocked by how many slaves they had used in their daily activities. But the experiment showed only direct energy use, not the energy required to grow the food they ate or to make their televisions and computers. It also ignored the energy to pick up their garbage, to operate the traffic lights in the city, or to power the military that provides defense. All of this demonstrates the extent to which each person living a modern life depends on an army of energy slaves. Because our energy slaves are the source of our convenience, we cannot expect billions of people to have a change of heart and give them up without resistance. People around the world have flocked into cities for economic opportunities, to live a better life. But life in cities is harsh for many people. Everywhere there are hard surfaces. Very few living things are apparent. Cities create a great emptiness, a confusion of mind. Because cities separate us from nature, they make us stupid about ordinary aspects of life. Living in buildings, we can mostly ignore the weather, the seasons, even the time of day. People in cities do not learn even the most basic elements of how to respond to natural conditions. The kind of knowledge that cities produce will be of little value in the future. To survive in a world with little energy, all of us will need to relearn what our grandparents and earlier generations knew about growing food, building houses with local materials, digging wells, raising farm animals, and finding medicines growing wild in fields and forests. To the extent that education of this sort can begin now, the easier the transition will be over the next 40 years. There are currently no public plans anywhere in the world for a low-energy future. The official declaration by the government that China will now seek to build an ecological civilization is a big step forward, but it is only one step. Most government policies are still based on the principles of modernity. That means leaders still seek technological solutions to the limits of nature. As a result, most government officials are deeply committed to modernist ideas and plans. Their thinking does not simply change because of a simple declaration. A key change that needs to take place is the vision of how rural areas of China should develop. The modernist ideology of industrial civilization says we should make the countryside look like the city. The postmodern ideology of ecological civilization says we should transform cities in the image of nature, which means making rural areas the model. This is a total reversal of values, from unfeeling, mechanical thinking to organic thinking that is based on feeling the rhythms of nature. How is it possible to change the orientation of China's local leaders? Certainly not by argument or pressure. No one changes that way. They will develop a postmodern ecological sensitivity only from direct experience. As grassroots activists in rural areas in China begin to build new communities that put ecological practices or principles into practice, you can invite government officials to participate. They will only learn by doing. It is important to open the hearts of officials to a new vision of the countryside as soon as possible. Officials who fully embrace the vision of an ecological civilization will be crucial in making the transition peaceful. As the transition occurs, the majority of the urban population of China will still hold modernist ideas. Most will try to cling to the way of life made possible by industrial civilization. When that way of life collapses, people will not suddenly embrace a new outlook. Instead, they will want the government to take aggressive action to find more coal or oil, to keep alive the modernist industrial dream. Some may even favor going to war for oil, for example. Unless a large number of officials have seen the possibility for a better way of life in the countryside, the modernists will dominate the new situation and impose their views. The sources of hope for the future lie in the countryside, not in cities. It is important to start building rural institutions that can provide leadership in the ecological civilization that will follow. This is a gigantic task, but an important one. The people who will lead us through the transition are the people who are currently ignored precisely because they have resisted the principles of modern life. Never before in human history has leadership for change come from the countryside. Cities held government officials, merchants, priests, and scholars. Those were the people with authority. The people of the countryside were always considered insignificant and unimportant until the military leaders needed an army. No one ever expected ideas to come from rural areas. Yet, it was farmers who maintained a human connection to nature, observing its regularities and changes. Farmers selected the right seeds for local conditions, learned how to integrate the farm animals into the cycles of plant growth, built small irrigation systems to regulate water supply, collected waste to renew the soil, and found ways to pass this knowledge on to the next generation for thousands of years. This knowledge was never valued by people in cities, but without it, the cities would have all died in ancient times. The countryside carried cities on its back, without thanks or appreciation. Now we turn once again to the countryside to save the remnants of civilization with the knowledge that was previously held in contempt. The hope for civilization comes from the potential of rural leaders to find a path through the coming darkness. Leadership will involve setting a good example. Creating a new social structure will be extraordinarily difficult when we are no longer sustained with electric grids, modern medicine, trained engineers, and rapid mobility. Farming without chemicals depends on the ability to integrate the work of humans, plants, animals, and soil microorganisms in a balanced way that took our ancestors thousands of years to develop. Since those skills have been buried under the weight of modern ideology, can we redevelop them in 10 to 20 years? We can learn from our ancestors, but much of our knowledge has been lost in recent generations. Even if a few thousand people have the right skills and knowledge, it will need to be transmitted to millions of people, including people with no experience at all. In addition to farming, everyone will need to learn skills that are now performed in factories: food preservation, pottery making, cloth making, waste management, and woodworking, to name a few. Libraries will be available, but most of the information they contain will be of little use. China, India, and African nations will have an advantage in a post-petroleum world. The network of largely self-sufficient villages still has some remnants in those countries. The relationships that provided a stable order based on local customs have not disappeared entirely. The processes for passing on traditional knowledge still exist in attenuated form. Even in remote villages, modernization has begun to erode the knowledge and the customs that sustained them for hundreds of years. But the fragments that survive will be the basis of starting over. The capacity to start over will depend on the preparation work that is done in the next 10 years. Continuing some form of civilization in the future requires reconstructing rural life today in such a way that it can be taught to others and passed on to future generations. That means the networks of organic farmers and community leaders need to create, without assistance, the functions of the existing education system. Even more daunting, this process needs to happen internationally, so that successful projects in one country can be replicated in others. To make the transition to an ecological civilization as peaceful as possible means that it must happen in every part of the world. Violence in any part of the world will spill over into neighboring countries. It is the responsibility of all of us to prevent violence anywhere. Whatever positive steps a person takes in one community must have the means of rippling out to the entire world. As the oldest continuous civilization in the world, China has the greatest advantage and the most to teach the world about how to sustain social order despite catastrophes. China's history is full of natural disasters, invasion by foreign enemies, and internal conflict. But through it all, China has preserved the characteristics of its civilization. Those traditions gave China stability until the ideology of modernity began to question all adherence to tradition. Many previous encounters with other traditions, such as Buddhism and Islam, made Chinese thought broader and more pluralistic. But modern thought rejects pluralism. It insists that modern science is the only source of truth. Modern thought has been an acid that burns away 5,000 years of accumulated wisdom in a century. We will soon discover that the optimism and arrogance of modern thought rested almost entirely on cheap energy. When that is gone, the shallowness of modern thought will be exposed, and the continuing value of Chinese tradition will become evident. The secret of China's success lies in its basic philosophical concepts of balance, harmony, dialectics, and its practices of Wu Wei, indirect action, and integrative education. These are just a few of the traditions that China has tested through experience over the past 5,000 years. Thus, the weight of responsibility for developing a positive future for the world falls more on China than anywhere else. People all over Asia and Africa are currently looking to China for answers. So the lines of communication are open to an unusual degree. But finding a way to communicate the value of China's traditions while remaining aware that other cultures have similar traditions of value will be a challenge. As world teachers, the people of China, particularly the farmers, must balance the particular and the universal in order to spread the benefits of Chinese civilization to the world. While preparing to send a message to the world, however, it is necessary to develop it at home. I want to suggest some of the challenges you will face in this venture as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. It might seem when contemplating a world with little energy available that the place to begin is with practical skills related to farming, fabric making, composting, house construction, and other necessary tasks. But those abilities can be exercised only in a context of social order that permits them. At present, the state government maintains order, but in low energy conditions that will exist in the future, the state's power will necessarily recede. As China has demonstrated again and again through its history, social order does not arise from force. Instead, it emanates from the ground up when there is a wise pattern to guide behavior. Modern thought has made our values childish or immature. At present, we desire things made by machine that are new and shiny, and we look down on old things that are made by hand. On a daily basis, we treat machines and their products as sacred, and we have discarded the traditions our ancestors developed over thousands of years. Modern values look forward to a future of convenience and efficiency. As modern life rapidly crumbles without the energy to sustain it, our values will readjust to the reality of life lived in harmony with nature. When growing enough food to keep everyone alive becomes a major challenge, we will learn to give thanks to the earth, the sun, and seeds. The things we hold sacred today will vanish, and we will shift our loyalty to things of enduring value. But this will not happen easily, because those who are alive today will continue to long for the easy life we have experienced with cheap energy. Learning to love and hold sacred the elements of nature that give us life will take generations. We will all need guides through that process. Thus, a big challenge today is developing and passing on that sort of wisdom before the majority of people have begun the transition to ecological civilization. That is why the wisdom of Chinese tradition is so important. In biology, the DNA of an organism determines what type of plant or animal it will be. The spirit of a culture is the social equivalent of DNA. The many facets of Chinese philosophy, from ancient tradition to Marxism, comprise the spirit of its culture. There is nothing more practical than wisdom, so the reconstruction of civilization depends on the preservation and reformulation of that wisdom in each generation. Just as Chinese philosophy incorporated the teachings of Confucius and Buddha and Marx, in accordance with changing conditions, it will need to continue to maintain its flexibility in adapting to new conditions. It is important to develop a comprehensive philosophy that is flexible and adaptable. Because modern science has been successful in many respects, it cannot be ignored. It needs to be incorporated in a more encompassing philosophy that appreciates the methods of science, but recognizes its weaknesses as well. I would suggest that constructive postmodernism passes the test. For simplicity, I will just call it postmodernism. Whereas modern science considers physics the starting point for understanding, postmodernism treats biology or ecology as foundational. Thus, it is also called the philosophy of organism. An important advantage of postmodernism is that it recognizes the insights of Chinese traditional philosophy instead of treating them as superstitions. Postmodernism is extremely difficult to understand in its abstract formulation. Thus, the main focus of those who have studied it should be to find ways to make it useful for the average person. If it is applied to 10 or 12 areas of experience in ways that show the practical differences with modern thought, it will be simple to teach it to others. In my view, the best place to start is with healing. The view of the body in traditional Chinese medicine overlaps the concept of an organism in postmodernism. The idea in modern medicine is that there must be a single, simple cause of illness. That rarely occurs. Most illness results from an imbalance of physical, chemical, biological, and spiritual factors. Sometimes Western medicine can help, but often it creates more problems than it solves because it always looks only at one part of the total condition and diagnoses the problem incorrectly. We need ongoing research as part of the transition to an ecological civilization on how to combine the best elements of Chinese and Western medicine, always keeping in mind that the traditional model, Chinese model of the organism, is the more comprehensive one. India's Ayurvedic medicine and the medical practices of other cultures will also contribute to a postmodern understanding of healing. No single culture has all of the answers. Postmodernism is pluralistic in its pursuit of truth. While postmodernism is a general guide that will improve with experience, we cannot wait for the perfection of this philosophy to begin taking action and formulating long-term plans. By acting and planning for the future, we will raise questions that will force us to deepen our understanding of postmodernism. Let us now examine some of the areas in which questions are likely to arise. The modern system is on the brink of self-destruction because it ignored nature and treated humans as if we stood outside of nature. Thus, a crucial task of developing an ecological civilization involves redefining the relationship of humans with nature. The decline in the availability of petroleum and natural gas will force change. Farmers will have to abandon chemical fertilizers and pesticides and develop integrated farms that rely on the power of nature. The price will rise for large sheets of plastic for ground cover and for greenhouse construction. In place of those modern devices, farmers will become even more dependent on the addition of organic material to build up the soil, and the search for organic supplements will affect urban residents as well. The value of seeds of each type of crop that can adapt to local conditions will become abundantly clear as the fertilizers required for modern hybrid seeds become too expensive. The demand for farm animals will grow rapidly for food, fertilizer, and muscle power. Instead of specializing in 2 or 3 crops, every farm will grow a variety of types of plants and animals, including species needed indirectly as pest predators and habitat for those predators. Every farmer will be an ecologist who can work with neighbors in creating a natural environment that supports an evolving balance of organisms. But the shift to ecological life goes beyond what happens directly on the farm. Every aspect of life in the nation, including life in cities, will have to change simply to make possible organic agriculture. Why are cities important for the transformation of agriculture? Cities operate on mechanical time or clock time. Farms are organized around nature time, seasons, the demands of animals, rainfall, the condition of soil. In industrial civilization, everything must now conform to industrial time. The same is true of waste processing. In nature and on the farm, waste is reused because everything flows in a cycle. In the city, value flows in and waste flows out in a single direct line. In an ecological civilization, time, waste, and many other cultural ideas will have to shift to natural rhythms. The whole nation is going to have to support organic agriculture. For example, one reason farming has become more industrialized, modernized, and mechanized every year is the need to send huge quantities of food from the countryside to the cities to feed the half of the population that live there. The scale of operations forces farmers to conform to the demands of the primary or secondary buyers who demand that farms conform to industrial values. The more separated the farm becomes from the people eating the food in the city, the more modernized the farm has to become, the more specialized farms become in producing a single crop, and the less organic and self-sufficient the farms become. It is absurd to expect farms to grow food organically when the whole operation is oriented toward the demand of the city. The only way to change farms is by changing the relationship between city and farm. When energy rises in price in the coming decades, life in cities will become more difficult. Fewer jobs, less income, less transportation, more crime, less housing, and so on. Coastal cities are also going to face rising water levels and increased storm activity because of climate change. Cities require massive inputs of energy to operate. Without cheap energies, cities will become unlivable. As more and more citizens take note of these problems in their daily lives, they will move. Perhaps some will move to a smaller city first and then to a town. Eventually, tens of millions of people will come to the countryside to live. In this way, the balance between city and country will be restored so that the majority of the population lives close to where its food is grown. That will cause another set of problems. But in terms of the balance of human and nature, a shift will occur in this way from industrial time and waste management to ecological forms of those cultural patterns. Where will the urban populations go when they search for a place in the countryside to settle? Will they be welcomed? Perhaps at first, villages will welcome young workers, but over time, there will be growing resistance to newcomers, especially if they come in large numbers. The available land will run out, and the size of farms might shrink to a point that can no longer support a family. If one village experiences this problem, a family might go elsewhere. But if every village in the nation is overcrowded, what then? Water scarcity will also be a problem. Old methods of managing water to conserve it for future use need to be rediscovered. Concrete dams will slowly deteriorate since concrete is a very energy-intensive material. Fortunately, China has long experience with water management that relies entirely on human ingenuity and human labor. The oldest natural flood control system in the world still operates in Dujiangyan, near Chengdu, by redirecting excess water from the Min River into channels where it can be used for irrigation. This is a perfect example of how Chinese traditional thought works, by using the power of the river without actually blocking the flow. The city of Sacramento, California, where I live, is protected by a similar bypass system on a major river. Perhaps we learned it from China. But industrial civilization does not design with nature in the same way. For over a century, we have built large cities in deserts and used high-grade energy to pump water long distances. Farms have also used electricity to pump groundwater to the surface faster than it can be replaced with natural water recharge. These water systems will begin to fail in the future without large inputs of energy. Los Angeles and Beijing are two cities in the world with very little water of their own. How long will they survive without water brought to them from a great distance? The vulnerability of agriculture is just as alarming as the threat to cities. Around 45% of the crops grown in China are in areas subject to high or very high risk of drought under current conditions. But that number will rise much higher when the price of electricity makes it impossible to pump enough water to sustain crop yields. In addition, even in Sichuan province, which normally has reliable rainfall, there have been severe droughts and floods in recent years. Although northern and western China are normally more drought-prone than southern China, droughts and famines have also occurred periodically in central provinces. I mention all of this as a reminder that no amount of local effort can fully prepare a village or township for the risks associated with weather, particularly now that climate change has increased the variability of rainfall. Modernization has damaged natural systems, and the damage will last hundreds or thousands of years. To be fair, we should give some credit to modernization for reducing famines by creating rail networks to carry food from one region of a country to others. This is one feature of modern civilization that ecological civilization should strive to copy. Otherwise, a different means of solving the problem of local vulnerability needs to be found. At the local level, 15 years of plentiful harvests can be reversed with 3 years of floods or droughts, leaving the population with little or no food. The idea that ecological civilization should strive for self-sufficiency, for local self-sufficiency, is deeply misguided. Until the population of China declines by about 90%, some form of national system to reallocate food in years of disaster will be necessary to reduce the suffering caused by the collapse of industrial civilization. This raises questions about how to organize the structures of government that maintain some degree of central authority, which is more likely to happen in China than anywhere else in the world. Thus, organic agriculture must be about more than successful harvests in years of good weather and adequate rainfall. It also involves planning for the long-range survival of thousands of communities during bad years or after earthquakes. Modernist thinking has been characterized by an excess of optimism, a false certainty that technology will solve relevant problems. Postmodern thinking needs to operate with a more tragic view of life that anticipates problems rather than reacting to them when it is too late. The famines and droughts that will sweep the world as energy systems fail could easily destroy civilization. Yet we must not think of civilization solely in terms of providing enough food and water. Even as we plan for ways to counteract the threat of starvation, we must also plan for the development of other skills that sustain civilized life, such as food storage, housing, transportation, medical care, decision-making, and intellectual development. Civilization needs artisans and scholars as much as it needs farmers. It may also require warriors. Discussing the future of social relations and governance is even more difficult than analyzing the relation to the natural world. We are accustomed to centralized governments that solve problems for us, so we do not have to think about them. Modern governments have the capacity to collect taxes and provide services, but modern tax systems are vulnerable. At present, the value-added tax plus corporate taxes comprise around 75% of government revenue in China, which means the government relies heavily on trade and industrial activity as its tax base. Central government revenue declined after 2012 and will likely face similar problems due to the pandemic. Continuous cuts in energy production in the future will be even more damaging to the ability to collect taxes. A prolonged energy shortage will damage both the industrial economy and the government's ability to operate. Governments also manage the national currency, which involves regulation of banks. There is no direct relationship between energy and the money supply, but there are indirect connections because money primarily circulates through the commercial sector, which will rapidly collapse when industries face energy constraints. It might seem that bank failures and a decline in the money supply are not important for rural areas, but many farmers depend on credit today and will go bankrupt if the money supply shrinks. Money and banking are important institutions that need to be maintained through the transition from industrial to ecological civilization. Experiments with local currencies have demonstrated their effectiveness at sustaining household commerce in a number of countries. During previous depressions, local currencies with negative interest rates were able to restore commerce at astonishing speeds. There may be advantages to developing regional currencies that extend beyond individual townships, but the best scope for local currencies can be learned by experience. All of the questions that civilizations have failed to answer for the past 6,000 years will remain problems to be solved. Some old problems will reemerge. The most basic question is whether ecological civilization will be based on equality or hierarchy. We might like to think that every person will be treated with equal dignity, but that is unlikely. It is probable that slavery will develop instead. In most countries, most of the land is owned by the wealthiest 10% of the population. As people leave their homes and cities, they will find all of the farmland locked up. They will become servants or slaves of the people and corporations that currently own the land. Otherwise, the newcomers will have to pay a share of each year's crop, which is what serfs do. It will be not quite slavery, but close to it. China has a better chance than most countries of avoiding this trap, but it will avoid a system of slavery only if institutions are designed to guarantee sharing of resources. The future direction of each village, township, or region will be determined by how land and water are allocated and the rules by which they are exchanged or passed on to the next generations after death. The rules determining those procedures will be only as strong as the bonds that tie people together into a single community, with a consensus about how to handle property and conflicts over it. These rules of ownership or control are the most fundamental questions of culture because they will define social values in a very concrete way by deciding who lives and who dies. Particularly in the early stages of transition, villages may need to decide whether to accept or reject newcomers if it seems there will not be enough food for additional settlers. What will the ethical basis be made? What will the ethical basis be of making those kinds of decisions? What aspects of Chinese culture will be drawn upon in deciding? Questions about slavery and autonomy or life and death will not be answered in a vacuum. The whole range of human relations that have developed in a community will enter into the process. How groups of people who are creating communities today resolve conflict among themselves is a good predictor of how they will respond in a crisis at some time in the future. There are hundreds of issues that will need to be resolved in a transition process. Everything will hinge on the way constitutional questions are asked and answered. By constitutional questions, I mean the process for deciding cultural conventions and formal rules. In our present civilization, we take for granted a definite answer for most of these questions. The answers were decided long ago. But as we transition to a new civilization, every question will begin anew. There are three questions that are the most difficult and the most basic. 1, what is true knowledge? 2, what is the basis of collective authority? And 3, what process will be used for making decisions? Most of our actions are now determined by habit, by ideas that we internalized at an early age. The transition to a new civilization requires that we become self-conscious about our lives at a new level, if that is possible. We must not only have an intuition of how we should act, we need to know why we are doing it. We will need to break old rules and create new ones. For example, as energy becomes scarce, people may be tempted to measure all value in relation to energy. But that would be a mistake. The health of communities is more important. Yet if we cannot clearly explain why social balance or equality or honor are of greater value than access to more energy, then the crudest values will probably win. What will prevent the reversion to a system in which the strongest men make all the decisions because they have physical power? China's history has answered that question more than once, but can we count on a similar process operating again, particularly since Chinese traditions have been under attack for 3 generations? This is why, in the calm before the storm, for all who care about the quality of future civilization, need to spend time thinking about how Chinese traditions have served communities in the past and how they can be preserved for the future. One measure of a civilization is how well women are treated. This is one area in which Chinese tradition is weak. Marxism deserves great credit for elevating the status of women in China. Can the greater degree of gender equality that Marxism made possible in China persist in an ecological civilization? Or will the renewal of ancient philosophical traditions undermine the condition of women? Perhaps this question can serve as a useful way to start a discussion about how to appropriate past traditions without simply treating all aspects of those traditions as sacred. But even if we decide we want to preserve gender equality, we must still learn how to create the conditions in which that goal will be realized in a more agrarian society. In other words, what institutions will need to function in an ecological civilization in order for women to be treated as equals on a daily basis, at home and in the community? My aim in these remarks has been to indicate the range of questions that need to be considered as we first begin to imagine the structure of an ecological civilization. Every aspect of our lives will be changed by the transition from industrial to ecological civilization. The way we work and the way we treat the land are 2 important dimensions. but we cannot consider those topics in isolation. We need to begin thinking about the full range of changes that need to be anticipated and managed. As organizations and networks grow that are devoted to the problem of making the transition, everyone involved needs to be aware of the complexity of the challenge. Diverse people with diverse skills and ideas will be needed. We are mostly in a collective state of confusion about how to design a new civilization, but there is one thing we can know with certainty. We need each other. Only by acting together will we succeed. Thank you.